The quiet season. The cabin sat at the end of a logging road that the maps had forgotten, 11 miles past the last paved turnoff, in a fold of the Cascades where the trees grew so close and so tall that even at noon the light came down green and underwater. Dale Renner had built it himself over 3 summers, hauling cedar and corrugated steel up the grade in a truck that he eventually let rust into the undergrowth because he no longer trusted anything with an engine and a registration number. He was 53 years old. He had not spoken to another living person in 19 days, and he counted this as a victory. Dale was a careful man. He kept records. In a series of black composition notebooks stacked on a shelf above his cot, he had logged the weather, his caloric intake, the contents of his cache pits, the rounds remaining in each of his weapons, and the slow seasonal drift of the deer trails through the basin below the cabin. He did not consider himself paranoid. Paranoia, he would have told you, was a failure to plan. What he had was discipline. The world had a way of coming apart. He had watched it strain and crack for years, in the news he no longer read, in the supply chains he no longer depended on. And when it finally tore through, Dale intended to be the kind of man who had already done the arithmetic. The first sign that something was wrong came on the morning of the 20th day, and it was such a small thing that a less careful man would not have noticed it at all. The woodpile had been moved. Not much. Dale stacked his split cordwood in a particular way, the way his grandfather had taught him, with the bark side up to shed water, and the ends squared so the pile would not slump in a thaw. He stacked it against the north wall of the cabin in 2 rows, and each night before he slept, he laid a single length of kindling across the top of the outer row, perpendicular to the rest, so that the morning would tell him if anything, a bear, a falling branch, a man, had disturbed his store. That morning the kindling lay on the ground. Dale stood over it for a long time with his coffee going cold in the tin cup, and he made himself consider the explanations in order of likelihood, the way he always did. Wind. But there had been no wind. The night had been still enough that he'd heard his own pulse in the dark. An animal. But there were no tracks in the frost-stiffened mud. No scat. No scuffing. The kindling itself had simply migrated 18 inches from where he'd placed it, and lay now in the dirt, as though it had been lifted and set down by a hand that did not wish to be careless, but had been, just slightly, just once. Settling, he said aloud, because his voice in the clearing made the morning feel ordinary again. Pile shifted. Frost heave. He replaced the kindling. He went about his day. He checked his snare lines along the eastern ridge and found a snowshoe hare in the 3rd one, dispatched it cleanly, gutted it where it hung. He returned at dusk, cooked the hare with dried thyme from the bundle that hung from his rafter, ate, washed his single plate, and lay down on his cot with his rifle within reach, and the 357 under his folded jacket, where his hand could find it, without his eyes. He slept poorly. He told himself it was the hair, the richness of it after a string of lean days. In the morning, the kindling was on the ground again. Dale Renner had not always been alone, and he had not always been afraid, though he would have rejected the word afraid with some heat. He had a son named Mark, somewhere in Sacramento, who had stopped returning his calls 4 years ago after an argument about— Dale could no longer reconstruct the argument exactly. only the shape of it. The way Mark's voice had gone flat and patient. The way he'd said, "Dad, I worry about you," in a tone that meant, "I have given up worrying about you." He had a wife once, Carol, who had not left him so much as gradually declined to remain, her presence in the house thinning year by year, until one day the house contained only the absence of her, neatly arranged. She lived in Bend now. He thought of her rarely, and with a dull ache he had learned to walk around the way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture in a dark room. He had come into the woods because the woods made sense. A thing was either food or it was not. A snare was either set correctly or it failed. The cold was honest. Hunger was honest. There was no one out here to look at him with patient eyes and a tone that said he had become a problem to be managed. Out here he was simply a man doing what a man was built to do, and the doing of it filled the hours and quieted the part of his mind that had spent 30 years in cities feeling vaguely and continuously that he was failing some test whose rules no one would explain. So when the kindling moved a second time, his first instinct was not fear, but a kind of offense. Something was testing him, and he did not like to be tested. He spent that day building a perimeter. He had brought trip flares, fishing line, a roll of copper wire, a set of game cameras he'd never bothered to deploy. He strung a low line of monofilament across the two approaches to the clearing, 12 inches off the ground, and hung a constellation of tin cans from it. He set the game cameras, there were 3, in the crooks of trees facing the cabin, the woodpile, and the trailhead. He checked the loads in his rifle and his pistol and the shotgun by the door. By the time the light failed, he had made the clearing into an instrument, a thing that would sing if it were touched. That night he did not lay the kindling on the pile. He sat up instead, in the chair by the cold stove, with the shotgun across his knees and a single candle burning. And he waited. The forest at night is not silent. Dale knew this. He had spent enough nights in it to have catalogued its sounds the way he catalogued everything. There was the settling tick of cooling wood. There was the occasional far-off cough of an owl. There was the wind that wasn't wind, the slow respiration of the great mass of trees breathing out the day's warmth. He sat, and he listened, and he separated each sound from the others, and named it and set it aside, and the candle burned down a finger's width, and his eyes grew heavy, and at some point, he could not afterward say when, he slept. He woke with the candle drowned in its own wax and gray light at the window, and the certain knowledge that he had failed. The kindling was on the ground. The trip line was intact. The tin cans hung undisturbed. He went to the game cameras with his heart going hard and steady in his chest, and he pulled the SD cards one by one and fed them into the cracked tablet he kept charged off his solar bank. And he watched. The camera facing the woodpile had recorded 41 events overnight. 40 of them were nothing. A moth, the drift of a falling leaf triggering the motion sensor, the slow swing of a branch. The 41st was time-stamped 3:47 a.m., and it showed the woodpile, gray and grainy in the infrared, the single length of kindling lying across the top row exactly where— No, he had not placed it there. He had decided not to place it there. He remembered deciding. In the footage, the kindling lay on the pile, and as he watched, in the silent green-gray gloom, it lifted. It did not fall. It rose slowly, an inch, 2 inches, as though held at one end by something the camera could not see, and it hung there a moment, trembling. And then it was set down, gently, almost tenderly, in the dirt at the base of the pile. The footage ran another 4 hours. Nothing else moved. Dale watched the 4 seconds of the kindling rising and falling 11 times. Then he set the tablet down very carefully on the table, as though it were full of liquid, and he went outside and was sick in the ferns, and afterward he knelt there a long while, with the cold seeping up through his knees, breathing. There is an explanation, he told himself. There is always an explanation. You have not found it yet. Finding it is the work. The careful man's mind is a machine for explanations, and Dale's machine ran hot for the next several days. He considered and discarded the possibility of a hoax. There was no one for 11 miles, no tracks, no second set of disturbances, and the labor of rigging an invisible wire to lift a stick at 3:47 in the morning was wildly out of proportion to its effect. He considered a hallucination, and this frightened him more than the alternative, because a hallucination meant the failure was inside him, and the inside of himself was the one terrain he could not survey. He considered, briefly, and then with mounting unease, the possibility that he had done it himself. Risen in the night, moved the stick, returned to his chair, remembered nothing. Sleepwalking. The brain doing in the dark what it would not own in the light. This last theory had the great virtue of being testable. He moved his cot against the door. He looped a length of paracord from his ankle to the door handle, so that if he rose, he would have to wake to free himself. He set the tablet to record audio through the night. And he kept his black notebook open on the table, and each evening he wrote down the day's events in his small square hand, because the writing was a kind of anchor, a way of pinning the days in place so they could not drift. Day 24, he wrote. Kindling moved again. Paracord intact. I did not rise. Audio recorded. Will review in AM. The audio, in the morning, was 11 hours of the forest breathing. At 3:47, he had come to wait for that hour the way a man waits for a recurring pain. There was nothing. No footstep, no scrape. Only, perhaps, if he turned the volume to its highest and pressed the cheap earbuds hard into his ears, a sound that might have been the wind and might have been a long, slow exhalation very close to the microphone. The sound a person makes when they are leaning over something with great care and concentration. The sound of held breath, let slowly out. He told himself it was the wind. The kindling was on the ground. It was around this time, day 26, his notebook said, that Dale began to feel watched. It came on gradually, the way the cold came on in the evenings, a thing he noticed first as a discomfort, and then could not stop noticing. He would be at the stove, or splitting wood, or sitting with his coffee, and he would feel between his shoulder blades the unmistakable pressure of attention, the animal certainty that eyes were on him. He would turn, slowly, the way you turn, when you do not want the thing behind you to know you've felt it, and there would be the trees, the green dark between the trunks, the clearing empty and ordinary in the failing light, and the feeling would not lift. It would simply relocate. Now it was behind him again. Now it was at the window. Now it was above, in the rafters, in the soft cobwebbed dark, where the smoke gathered. He was a man who had spent his life learning to trust his instincts, to honor the lizard part of the brain that knew danger before the reasoning part could name it. That training betrayed him now, because every instinct he had was screaming that he was not alone, and every fact he could gather said that he was. The two could not both be true, and he did not know which one to disbelieve. And the not knowing was a wedge driven slowly into the center of him. He stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours at a stretch. He developed the habit of speaking aloud to the cabin, narrating his actions. Now I'm filling the kettle. Now I'm checking the east line. Because the sound of his own voice was the only thing that pushed back against the silence that had begun to feel less like absence and more like a presence holding very still. He noticed that he had begun to leave the candle burning all night, an extravagance he would have scolded himself for a month ago, the waste of it, the way it ate his stores. But the dark had changed. The dark had developed a texture, a grain, a sense of depth, as though it were not empty space, but a substance, and somewhere in that substance, patient and unhurried, something was attendant to him. On day 28, he found the second sign. He had gone down to the cache pit at the bottom of the basin, the one where he kept his bulk staples sealed in 5-gallon buckets, rice, beans, oats, the things that meant he could outlast a long winter or a longer collapse. He pried up the camouflaged lid and lowered himself in and began his inventory. The count he performed weekly, and he reached the 4th bucket and stopped. Someone had eaten from it. Not much. The bucket of rolled oats was perhaps a cup lighter than his record said it should be, and the surface of the oats was disturbed, scooped, as though a hand had reached in and taken a fistful, and the rest had been smoothed back imperfectly, with a care that did not quite manage to hide the theft. He stared at it. He took out his notebook and checked the figure, and the figure was correct. He was certain it was correct. He had never in his life been careless with a number that mattered. And here was the thing that he could not walk around, the thing that lodged in him and would not be reasoned away. Whatever moved the kindling had no need to eat. A wire, a hallucination, a sleepwalking self. None of them ate oats. But a thing that ate, a thing with a hand and a mouth and a hunger, that was a different kind of fact. That was a fact with weight. And the care of it, the smoothing back, the way it had tried and failed to hide what it had taken, that was the most terrible part, because it meant the thing wanted him not to know, and wanting him not to know meant it had a relationship to his knowing, meant it was thinking about Dale Renner, in the dark, in the green silence, thinking about what Dale would see and how Dale would feel. He climbed out of the pit. He sealed it. He went back up the grade to the cabin, and he loaded all 4 of his weapons, and he sat in the chair with the shotgun across his knees, and he did not narrate. He did not speak at all. He listened, and the forest breathed, and somewhere in the breathing he was almost sure now that there was a second rhythm, slower than his, deeper, the respiration of something very large that had learned to breathe quietly so as not to disturb the small, warm creature it had decided to keep. He resolved to leave. It shamed him to make the decision, and it shamed him more that the decision came as a relief. He was a survivalist. The woods were his element. He had built this place with his hands and stocked it against the end of the world. And now the world had not ended, and he was going to flee his own cabin because a stick kept moving and a bucket of oats had been disturbed. He could imagine Mark's voice, flat and patient. He could imagine the look on the face of the ranger at the station 11 miles down, the careful blankness people put on when they were deciding whether you were dangerous or merely sad. But he was going to leave anyway, because underneath the shame was something older and truer, the animal certainty that had never once led him wrong. This place is not safe, and it is going to become less safe, and the time to go is before you understand exactly why. He packed in the gray of the next morning. He was methodical even in his fear. He took the things that mattered: the weapons, the ammunition, the notebooks, the water filter, the med kit, a week of dense food. He shouldered the pack and stepped out into the clearing, and the 11 miles of logging road unspooled in his mind. The long grade down through the green dark, and he set off down it at a steady pace, not running, never running, because a man who runs in the woods turns his ankle, and a man with a turned ankle is a man who has surrendered his options. He walked for what his watch said was 2 hours. He came back to the clearing. He stood at the edge of it, at the trailhead, looking at his own cabin with the cold spreading slowly through his chest, and he could not at first make himself believe it. He had walked downhill. He had followed the road, the only road, the road he had built and traveled 100 times. He had not doubled back. He had watched the trail the entire way, the ruts, the rocks, the leaning snag he used as a landmark at the first switchback. He had passed it. He was certain he had passed it. And yet, here was the clearing, the cabin, the woodpile, the cold, dead stovepipe, exactly as he had left them 2 hours before. "All right," he said aloud, and his voice shook, and he hated that it shook. "All right. You got turned around. It happens. It happens to everyone. You'll go again, and you'll mark the trail, and you'll watch your compass, and you'll be careful." He had a compass. He had 3. He took the good one from the pack, the lensatic one, and he held it flat in his palm and watched the needle settle, and it pointed north, steady and true, and he oriented himself by it and started down the road again, with the needle held before him like a small, certain god. He walked. He marked the trees with a hatchet as he passed, a fresh blaze every 50 yards, white wood bright against the bark. He watched the compass. The needle held north. The road went down. He passed the leaning snag, and he cut a deep blaze into it and walked on, downhill, north-northwest, the way home lay, the way out lay, and he counted his blazes, 12, 13, 14. And at the 18th blaze, the road opened into a clearing, and he stopped, because he knew the clearing. And there on the north wall of the cabin was the woodpile, and on the trees around the clearing were 18 fresh white blazes, his own, gleaming, and on the leaning snag at the edge stood the deep cut he had made, and his compass, when he looked down at it, still pointed faithfully north. He sat down in the road. He sat down in the dirt with his pack still on his back, and he put his face in his hands, and for a while he made a sound he had not made since he was a small child, a thin, helpless sound, and the forest breathed around him, patient, unhurried, glad. He was sure of it now. He could feel it like a warmth on his skin. Glad to have him home. The notebook saved him for a while. When the worst of it had passed, and the cold of the ground had driven him back inside, Dale did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to gather data. He could not leave. Very well. That was a fact like the cold and the hunger, and a man dealt with facts. He would understand the thing that held him here. He would survey it the way he had surveyed everything, and he would write down what he found, and the writing would hold the world in place. Day 31, he wrote, his hand steadier now that it had a task. Cannot leave clearing by the road. Returns to origin regardless of bearing. Compass functional, confirmed against sun position. Phenomenon is spatial, not navigational error. He tried the other directions over the following days. He tried going due east, up the ridge, off trail, through the Deadfall and the Devil's Club, and at the top of the ridge where there should have been the far slope dropping away toward the river, there was instead the basin. His basin. The cabin small and gray at the bottom of it. He tried walking the perimeter of the clearing in a tightening spiral, trusting that if he never lost sight of the cabin, he could not be turned around. And the spiral tightened and tightened, and brought him to the cabin door from the direction in which he had started, having somehow circled the entire structure, while only ever walking away from it. He wrote it all down. Day 33. Spatial loop confirmed in all 4 cardinal directions and intermediates. The clearing is a closed surface. There is no exit by walking. He ate from his stores, and his stores held. And this, too, he recorded. And it was on day 35 that he understood the most terrible thing he had yet understood, which was that the bucket of oats was full again. He had not refilled it. He had measured it on day 28 and found it a cup short, and he had measured it every day since, watching it dwindle as he ate, and on day 35 he lowered himself into the cash pit and pried the lid from the 4th bucket. And it was full, brimming, the oats smoothed flat across the top, fuller than it had ever been, fuller than he had filled it. And he understood. It was not taking from him. It was feeding him. The realization arrived whole, the way the worst realizations do, and once it had arrived, he could not unsee the pattern of it threaded through everything. The hair in the snare on the night he'd been hungriest, the snare he could not now remember setting in quite that spot, the way his water never seemed to run low, the way the wood, though he split it and burned it, never quite diminished, the pile renewing itself by some accounting he had failed to keep. He had thought he was surviving by his own discipline, his own careful hands, and all the while something had been provisioning him, keeping him fed and watered and warm, the way a man keeps an animal he intends to keep a long time. The care of it. That was what undid him. Not malice. He could have understood malice, could have fought it, could have died fighting it like a man. But this was not malice. This was husbandry. This was the smoothing back of the oats, the gentle setting down of the kindling, the long, slow breath let out so as not to wake him. Whatever shared the clearing with him did not want to hurt him. It wanted to keep him. It had decided, in whatever vast and patient way such a thing decided, that Dale Renner was worth keeping, and it was going to keep him, fed and watered and warm and absolutely, perfectly, eternally alone, for as long as it pleased, which might be forever. He stopped writing in the notebook for 3 days. When he began again, his hand was not steady at all. Day 38th. The entry read, the letters cramped and pressed deep into the page. I am not its prisoner. I am its pet. He fought it the way a man fights, which is to say, he tried to make the keeping unprofitable. If the thing wanted him alive and warm and fed, then he would refuse to be those things, and perhaps, faced with a charge that declined to thrive, it would lose interest and let him go. Or kill him, which by day 41 he had begun to consider not as a defeat, but as an exit, the one door he might still be able to open from the inside. He stopped eating. He let the stove go cold. He sat in the dark cabin in his coat, with his breath smoking, and he refused the gifts that were left for him. And the gifts kept coming. A bird, a grouse, would be lying on the threshold in the morning, freshly killed, neatly arranged. The wood box by the stove would be full though he had let the last log burn to ash. He would wake from the thin, shivering sleep of the starving to find a blanket over him that he had not pulled up, tucked at the edges with a tenderness that made him weep, because there was no malice in it. None, only a terrible patient love, the love of an owner for a thing it has decided to cherish. And how do you fight love? How do you starve yourself out of being cherished? He grew weak. The starving brought a clarity that was almost peace, the body simplifying itself, the world reducing to a few bright essentials. And in that clarity he began, against his will, to listen to the thing. Not for a sound, for it made no sound he could swear to, but for a presence, a shape in the dark. And he found that if he stopped fighting, if he let his careful mind go slack, he could almost feel the contours of it. It was very old. It was very lonely. Lonely in a way that had nothing human in it. The loneliness of something that had been the only thing in this fold of the woods for longer than there had been words for woods. And it had watched the small warm creatures pass through its domain for 10,000 years. The deer and the bear and the occasional man, watched them and wanted them, and never known how to keep them, until it had learned, slowly, painstakingly, the way to make a clearing into a closed surface, the way to refill a bucket of oats, the way to tuck a blanket around a sleeping man so that he would not be cold. It did not understand that it was a horror. It thought it was being kind. That was the worst of it. That was the thing Dale could not bear. Lying in the dark on day 44, with his ribs standing out under his coat, and the grouse cooling on the threshold, that the thing keeping him meant well, that it had no concept of his terror, that to it the cabin and the clearing and the full bucket and the warm blanket were love, were a gift, were the very best it had to offer, and it was offering all of it to him, forever. And there was no way to make it understand that the gift was a tomb. On day 46, Dale Renner did the thing he had never once done in his careful, fortified, self-sufficient life. He spoke to it. He had refused to before. Speaking to it would have meant admitting it was there, and admitting it was there would have meant surrendering the last fortified position of his sanity, the position that held that there was an explanation, that the world was made of facts a careful man could survey. But he was past that now. He was past most things. He sat up on the cot in the gray underwater light, and he faced the dark in the corner where the presence felt thickest, the corner above the woodbox where the shadows gathered. And he said, in a voice cracked from disuse and hunger, "I know you're there." The forest breathed. The cabin held still, and the dark in the corner seemed to thicken, to lean toward him, to attend. "I know what you are."